All right. Well, we are concluding part one of our interview with Helen Whitney, documentary filmmaker, award-winning documentary filmmaker. We've talked about her films with Pope John Paul II, about monks in a monastery, and about 9/11. And now it's time to turn to the movie that, the film that so many of us owe you a huge debt of gratitude for, and it's the documentary called The Mormons. And it came out in 2007, 2 years after Mormon Stories Podcast hit the scene. And it had so many people who have become an important part of the evolution of Mormonism between then and 2018, which we're living now. So I'm going to invite our listeners to send more comments or questions about the movie or memories if they want to thank Helen. But let's just start. How did you first get the idea to do a four-hour, right?
It's 4 hours.
A 4-hour documentary on Mormons of all the religions you could have studied. Why Mormons, and how did that happen?
Well, it's really, in some ways, there's a kind of a continuation of the monastery in that it's a radical religion. It's not a Sunday religion, from what I knew about it. It is not sort of 2 hours listening to a great sermon and having communion and feeling good thoughts. The Mormons, from what I knew about them before I started this film, and I knew something, which we can talk about later, Monday nights and missionary work and all-day church, and that interested me. It really did. It's kind of a radical commitment. It's a commitment of time. And as I got to know more Mormons, who many of them had serious jobs, accomplishments, many children, and all the time they spend in church and doing whatever that they do, I was thinking, how do they do it all? And I have really, I make friends from every film. Not many, but, friendships are always hard, but I get to know people well. And I think there isn't a film, even going far back in the gang kids, every so often there's a juvenile delinquent who's now grown up who calls me and sees how I'm doing. But I made more friends, more good friends, who I'm still close to in this film than any other film.
Really?
I met fascinating people, mainly liberal Mormons, questioning Mormons, or people who've left the faith, but the theology, but absolute kind of keep close to its show-upness of faith. The core of Matthew. If you want to find me, you'll find me in the prisons, you'll find me on the street, you'll find me in the sickbed. That side of Mormonism. So no, that was unusual. I've met fascinating people, but friendships are something else, and they've lasted. I love coming back to Salt Lake. I'm looking forward to the screening tonight. I've got close friends who are coming, and Greg Prince, who introduced us. I hang out with him. My daughter spent her honeymoon at his house in Georgia, I think, North Carolina. So.
How did it start?
All right, I've been curious. If something was in the background, I met some Mormons at the University of Chicago, so who were smart and funny, and so I didn't arrive with any of the stereotypes which are alive and well, and they persist today. So I had none. So I met the best of Mormons.
The listeners should realize Fawn Brodie, who wrote a world-famous biography of Joseph Smith, she went to the University of Chicago.
She did.
Back in the 40s, right? And that's where No Man Knows My History comes out of. So,
and her book was part of it. I read that book. I did not see it as a debunking book at all. Joseph, wild and mystical, and yes, a contradiction, and yes, there are many sides to him, but I put that book down. I thought, wow, this is something I must come back to. And then I happened to be close to Harold Bloom. He was one reason I got
Who is he, for those who don't know?
Harold Bloom is one of the great literary critics of our time. great. I mean, he teaches up at Yale now. He's written many, many books. He's written on Shakespeare, and he's written on Job. He's a secular Jew, but he's fascinated with the Mormons, the early Mormons, not 20th century Mormons, not 21st century Mormons.
19th century.
He's very critical of them having lost their distinctiveness. He thinks that, and he's at dinner one night, he said to me, Helen, Joseph Smith is an authentic religious genius. And he really brought something new into religion. He opened up the canon, right? American religion. He opened up the canon. He promoted the continuing revelation. He believed that we could have a new relationship to God. I mean, he's a poet. This is all Harold Bloom, sitting there saying 19th century Mormonism is fascinating. He wrote about it. And I thought, wow, that's pretty interesting. Okay, and I know about the radical commitment, and then I'm close to another religious writer, Elaine Pagels, who's won all kinds of awards, written about her writings about Gnosticism and the early Gospels, and she said to me one night, she said, I think, with all your questions about belief and unbelief and faith, and she said, if you make a film about the Mormons, because I was floating it in front of her, she said, you have a chance to look close up at a religion in the making, a religion being formed. And she said, not only are you going to learn about Mormonism, you're going to learn about Christianity. You are going to learn about all those growing pains of any religion, revelation, prophet, hardening of the core beliefs, the institutions taking over, the quarrel over the canon, the push towards moving to metaphor or not. She said, what the Christian religion has is that it's lost in time. We know very little about that prophet. We know very little about his quirks, his greatness, we've saved something, but not very much. He said, you'll be able to just look at the birth of a new religion and learn about a religion that is a primary interest to you, which is Christianity. And I thought, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, though, getting my feet wet, I almost jumped out. I went to a... what do they call it? I went to one of the ward.
A service, like a sacrament meeting.
Yeah, a sacrament meeting. But once a month you have a testimony.
Oh, yeah, fast and testimony meeting.
Yes, I went to that. And
in New York?
No, it was out here, I believe. I went to them in New York as well. But the one that upset me, and it wasn't unusual, is that everybody got up and they used the word "I know" this to be true, as opposed to in sort of the traditions. I know, I have hopes that this is true. I have faith in this. I even have a belief. I know. I saw an arrogance in it, and it really put me off. I'm someone who, my friends who are interested in spiritual ideas are all questioners. They're all sort of out of some kind of Graham Greene novel, including Lorenzo Albacetti, and it just seemed, God, that kind of certainty, will that be interesting to me? And then I came to realize when I spent my 3-4 years making this series that there are many doubting Thomases within the Mormon landscape, in the Mormon landscape, and faith is a many-layered sort of organism within Mormonism as well, despite the language of certainty. I'm not talking about the hierarchy and their attitude towards questioning, particularly church's history, and their attitudes. I'm talking about the average Mormon, but I almost pulled back. At that moment I thought, I don't know. And then I started meeting wonderful Mormons, and then I had that meeting with a church official who decided that I would really have the access I needed. And
Can you talk about that, or would you rather not?
oh, that's fine.
Who's
I hope I don't get him into trouble. But I didn't talk to the church in the beginning. I decided I would circle around them and decide whether I wanted to make this film. I mean, making a film for me is a huge investment, as it is for everybody. And to Frontline's credit, they gave me the time and a little bit of money that I just got my feet wet. And do I want to do this? Can I make the film I want? And so obviously the church began to hear that I was talking to people, and I get a call from them.
This is early 2000s, right?
I must have been, it was
2004.
It was years before the film. It was right in the beginning of the research, which lasted quite a while. I think I got a call from not this period, but someone from the church saying, we're open to talk to you. And and I thought, well, why not now? So Michael Purdy, who is then was head of publicity for the church, I think. I made an appointment with him, and I'll never forget it. I flew out to Salt Lake, and it was early afternoon, and I was alone with him in the conference room, a huge, long table. He sat at one end, and I sat sort of around him. And we talked for hours and hours and hours. And he'd seen all my films up to date, which I thought very smart. And I think he realized that, obviously the church would have preferred that the first big film that PBS, the only film that PBS ever did about the Mormons, would be made by a believer. Obviously, that would have been the dream. But that I was probably their best shot at a textured, nuanced, and respectful film that didn't avoid the tough questions. At some level, I think, and then when he saw the films, so anyway, we had a great conversation, a human conversation. I was very open about what I wanted to do and the access that I wanted. I didn't care so much about whether I had an interview with a prophet. I learned that a lot of those interviews are not as revealing as what you're hearing on a more granular level, but I thought that would be interesting, but I wasn't. But that I didn't want to arrive at small towns in which I'd found someone quite interesting and hear that the word had gone out by, the local bishop that I wasn't supposed to talk to this person, because I had heard journalists had trouble. And at the end of that 4 hours, he said, I want this. He said, I certainly will talk to the powers that be, but he said, I trust you. I will do everything in my power to make everything open for you. Nothing is off bounds. And of course, he said, I know that we will never be allowed to see any footage, which he wasn't, or be able to shape in any way the content of this film above and beyond what we say when you interview us. And that was true. And I had access to everyone. It isn't top heavy on the so-called important people. I went out and found most of that film is about, ordinary folks who live and breathe Mormonism, or they're having left Mormonism, and historians of all stripes. But it was wonderful that when obviously people called into the church, I know they did. They said, we're going to check with our bishop whether we should be talking to you. Always do it. And so.
And this is something that had never happened before, and I don't believe has ever happened since. You interviewed Gordon B. Hinckley, who was prophet. You interviewed Dallin H. Oakes, Boyd K. Packer, who was probably president of the Quorum of the 12 at the time. You interview Terrell Givens. You interview, all the way to Michael Coe. You interview, D. Michael Quinn, Margaret Toscano. It's this all-star cast of really important Mormon thinkers and historical figures from all sides of the equation.
All sides.
Even Jeffrey R. Holland you interviewed. I don't know how much of the interview made it into the actual movie, but it's like that unprecedented access has never happened prior, and I'm not sure it'll ever happen again.
Wow.
I don't think Thomas S. Monson even granted an interview with sort of a journalist or during his whole time as prophet. And we'll see if Russell and Nelson follow suit. But I just that in alone is a remarkable achievement that you got that access, right?
Well, I was delighted by that. I really was, and I have to credit the church on that. I mean, I really do.
Michael Purdy in the church.
Michael Purdy really was the gateway. And there were a few times when he and I would be having dinner late at night. Dinner, by that I just mean sitting in that big office and with a sandwich and of course there were probably people in the church, he didn't say this to me, that were upset. They were, talking to some of these dissident intellectuals, dissenters. And he would joke and say, well, I wonder whether I'll be needing a new job at the end of this. I mean, he was putting himself on the line as well. And he really was. He didn't know what he had trust in me, I think, from that 4-hour conversation. He had every right to have trust. And then he saw the films, saw the Monastery, saw all the other ones that had preceded it. And it was the right choice to have made. He made a wise choice, but he didn't know. And, he put himself out. He really did.
So what I want to do is kind of go through some of the themes and hear your impressions or memories of some of the themes that you tried to cover. And then I'm going to mention some of the people you interviewed and have you share some comments about some of the people. Is that okay?
Okay.
So Joseph Smith.
Well, he's the opening act. The film is divided into 6 or 7 sort of historical moments or ideas that are central to Mormonism. And, of course, revelation is everything. And it's Joseph Smith who was the opening act of the film. And I try to establish very early on in the tease that Joseph Smith, just like John Paul II, is a man of contradictions, and people can't settle on what he is, depending on your point of view. He's either charlatan or a prophet, or he's both, visionary, liar, sexual license or sexual visionary. And nobody doubted his charisma and his ability to get people to follow him. No small thing. He really was like a Moses leading people out into the desert. I mean, Brigham Young was, but he led Brigham. He really did. And he was a fascinating, complicated character. And Mormonism is rooted in him and what you think about him and the truth of his revelations and the Book of Mormon. He embodies the richness, the contradictions, the darkness, and the light.
Did you feel like you wanted, just like Harold Bloom, did you want to arrive at a conclusion, like what a fake or what an abusive guy or what a genius? Did you find yourself concluding your own view of Joseph Smith, or do you avoid that as a filmmaker?
I avoid that. I think after reading Fawn Brodie's book, which, as I said, was not a debunking book, I felt the wildness and the largeness of this man that it would be hard to. But I think that one thing that serious historians of religion, are very careful not to do was to crawl inside someone's revelation, whether it's Luther's, Joan of Arc's, Joseph Smith's, and I think most historians bracket truth claims. They bracket them. And what's of interest, and Jacob Neusner really said it well, when I brought up those questions with him, he said, look, what we're looking at, any reputable historian of religion, I mean, leaving aside the obvious crackpot religions, and most religions do begin as cults. They are intense in the beginning and fired up by someone, and then they sort of relax, the institution comes in, and things loosen up, and to what degree is, of course, the great question. But he said, how a religion is lived out, to what degree do the followers believe in it? How is it manifested in their lives? This is what's of interest. This is what's of interest, and what we as historians can look at with some objectivity. Religions rise and fall, die and flourish. Why? But bracket the truth claims. Bracket the truth claims.
There's kind of, let's just say, a category that Martin Luther or the Dalai Lama or Pope John Paul II is, which is like revered, respected religious leader, historical, right? And then there's
with a lot of pushback.
Right,
too.
right.
Yeah,
they're complex, like you said, but they're respected.
Yes.
And then there's like David Koresh and Warren Jeffs and, these people that we all kind of go, they're abominable, they're despicable, they're bad people, right?
Or can cause great problems,
And did you feel like Joseph Smith qualified in either of those buckets or neither? Or
I felt he qualified them both. I mean, I didn't, I felt, yes, he has elements of the charlatan in him. I think that his polygamy, which was taken completely seriously by his followers, was a revered religious principle as baptism is for Christians. I mean, his motivations, yes, I think in part it was sexual and partially visionary, partially fueled by a male libido. I mean, I think it was a mixture of a lot of things. And I think he was a genuine visionary. I think he was a charismatic person. And I don't think he was a bad person at all. And I think there were elements of sexual license, obviously. I think that, and the whole question of the gold tablets. I mean, I'm agnostic in part on it, but the power of his visions and what he was putting forth, the opening up of that conversation between God and man, Christ and man, I mean, my God, there's been a silence ever since Christ has died, and why? So I feel he is complex and worthy of great respect, and also of great criticism as well. He made a lot of bad moves. He pushed in ways that he provoked violence as well as was the victim of violence, as did the Mormons. There was great provocation along with great injustice visited upon them. Great provocation as well, But like most religious figures, the great ones like John Paul II, there were many sides to him. I mean, he was someone to grapple with.
did you have any idea, making the film at the time, that you would be introducing tens of thousands of Mormons to the true history behind their own faith for the first time? Several of our listeners have written in and said, I didn't realize Joseph Smith was a polygamist until I saw Helen Whitney's film. Now, these aren't people that had joined the church yesterday. These are people that had been Mormons for decades, learning from your film on PBS for the first time about Mountain Meadows Massacre, about Joseph Smith's polygamy. Did you have a sense that you would be educating Mormons about their own faith?
Not when I entered the film, but a year into it, when I began to talk to devout Mormons, intelligent, accomplished professionals, I was taken back to the degree which some of this was new to them. I mean, I remember going to the Joseph Smith conference at the Library of Congress, which was fascinating. It was really an interesting 3 hours, and Dallin Oaks was there with his daughter, who played the violin, and I use her music throughout the film.
Jenny Oaks Baker?
Yes, Jenny Oaks Baker. She has a sound in her violin. What she pulls out of a violin is extraordinary, and I use her playing that favorite hymn of Joseph Smith, the one he allegedly sang before he was
A
assassinated.
Poor Wayfaring Man of
Yes,
Grief.
and I use that in the Mormon film, and I also use it in my forgiveness series. I love it. I use her playing of it, nobody else's. But anyway, so there I am at the Joseph Smith conference, and it's a big deal. It is Mormonism come to the Library of Congress, and it's a very smart exhibition, but obviously there are glaring black holes, and one of them was Joseph Smith was a polygamist. I mean, it just wasn't in all, and they covered a lot, but they didn't cover that. And of course, when I took my tour of Brigham Young's house, when I came to do the tours of no one mentioned it, and all the bedrooms that are floating, I'm thinking, the tour guide didn't even mention that there were more than one wife. I mean, that was a long while ago.
The Limehouse, the Beehive House, right?
Yeah, the Beehive House.
Yeah.
I was startled. I was, and of course, I had no desire to engage her in some kind of argument, but I did pull her aside later on. I said, I just don't think you do any service to Brigham Young, and by being ashamed of this fact that is known by a lot of people and will ultimately be known by all. And I remember I had lunch with Dallin Oaks, and I talked about this question of Mormon literacy of their own religion. And by the way, a lot of Christians are illiterate about their religions too. I mean, their religion as well, and as are Muslims probably to a less degree. And we had an interesting conversation. I mean, he felt, and I don't agree, I'm trying to remember, this is a long while ago, that youngsters should be introduced to all these complexities slowly and under guidance. And I said, you can't control that. I said, the internet is out there. Do you want for them to hear it on a site that has no complexity? Is just some ex-Mormon who's ranting in the least textured way about all the stuff they hate about your religion, and that's among them? Or do you want to control it by, yes, fine, but saying it now? I mean, don't wait. If you think that at 17, at this point with the internet, people aren't going to be out there, but I did discover that many people, particularly an older generation, they're not sort of adept in the internet, and there was a lot that people didn't know that I felt was pretty obvious.
Did you get a sense the church was hoping you wouldn't talk about Joseph's polygamy?
Yeah,
and that you wouldn't talk
sure
about
they
Meadows
didn't have
Massacre?
any great hope that I wouldn't, but I think given their druthers, they're only human. They didn't put up any. They knew I was talking to famous historians of polygamy. They knew I was talking to everybody about Meadows Massacre. There was no way, and to their credit, when the film came out, and of course, in the beginning, the real conservatives didn't like it, and I think they put up a website saying, look, it wasn't a wholehearted, stop what you're doing and see this film. It wasn't like, look no further, this will be the greatest series of evening, but saying, this is a good film, it's a respectful film, and so it calmed everybody down. The church did put that out.
Mm-hmm. Are there some backstory around your discussion of the Meadows Massacre that you would want to share about people's reaction to it or the discussion of it? Or
yeah, I mean, yes, I think there's an amazing moment in the film, in the in the interview that is shown on film, but there's also a backstory to it. I not only looked at what happened in the Meadows Massacre and all the intricacies, which many Mormons know a great deal about, I was also interested in how the fact of it, the horror of it too, lived on in the lives of the descendants of those victims of the Mount Meadows Massacre. And so they get together as well, these victims, and Will Bagley brought me to one of their conferences, and I then started making phone calls on my own, and the degree to which families have been consumed by this was unnerving to me and sad. And there was one particularly articulate woman, a beautiful woman, and I interviewed her, in which she said, I can't tell you the waste of time. We're around the dining room table, and she said, for example, I had a prom dress, and I wanted people to notice I was going out, and I've got my relatives obsessing about this particular event, and why hasn't the church acknowledged it and apologized for it? They don't even say it happened. And she said, and here I am going out a big event. And she said, my childhood is riddled with these moments on which we're lost in the midst of time around that. And it's alive and well, and no one is getting any bigger talking around it or more insightful. We're just obsessing around it. And I resent it. I resent the lost time of our family around it. It's a beautiful interview, and in it she's critical of her own relatives as well as the church. So I decide I'll show a small section of that to Dallin, and I said I don't want to have an aha moment and tell you about this interview and how you respond. I'd like to give you time to look at it and respond or not. So he looks at this interview. And he goes off in the corner, and he's by himself. And
this is Dallin H. Oaks.
Dallin H. Oaks. He's got, he came in with a kind of flotilla of people, but he didn't even talk to them. He just went off and he thought by himself. And then he said, okay, I'd like to talk. And I wish I had the transcript in front of me, but it was as close to an apology as you can get. And he really said, my heart grieves for what these descendants have gone through and the loss of time for their families and the life that has been sort of taken away from them by our failure to acknowledge this event and all of its I wish I had it in front of me, but it came very close to the apology they wanted. It certainly came to acknowledgement, which is very important from an important person. And it meant a lot. It meant a lot. And I think that giving him the time to reflect on it and not spring it on him with, so look. Gotcha.
You didn't do that.
I didn't. I just don't do that. And I think I got the deeper, more thoughtful, and honest response.
And eventually the church did sort of issue a quasi-apology, right?
They did.
Do you think maybe you helped
I don't.
That's
a grandiosity I don't have, but I do think this film did provoke many conversations in families, among the elders, among bishops, among ward people. I have no idea what Gordon Hinckley thought about it, but there was a lot of talk, I know. And I think perhaps good talk.
What was it like trying to talk about the Mormon temple ceremony? Because you do talk about that in the documentary, and that's something that the church has always been very guarded about and sensitive about.
Yeah, I mean, you see it in the film. They have some footage that they gave me of empty rooms, which I was very appreciative of, and I explore the meaning of the temple and its importance in Mormon life. I also explore the effect it's had on outsiders and how it's contributed to the problem of the unease the outer world has with Mormons. It seems to be, the church seems to be shrouded in secrecy around polygamy and about the temple, and it's a self-inflicted wound for many people, that people can't go in, so what happens inside? And I understand what happens inside is extremely important. And so I explore explore all the rituals, the baptisms, the marriages, and its importance to Mormons, and how it's seen in the outside world, a world that the Mormons very much want to accommodate themselves to and to be accepted by, and the ways sometimes they make it difficult. And secrecy makes it difficult.
Was the church nervous that you were talking about the temple?
Yes, but they made that footage available to me.
Nice.
They did. They did.
So for me, when I was at BYU as a young man, I witnessed the excommunication of the September 6th. Michael Quinn, Paul Toscano, Lavina Fielding Anderson, that was my college. You had your Chicago experience. Yeah. I was at BYU while the church was excommunicating intellectuals. And that put a big freeze on Mormon intellectual life for another 12 years or more until internet blogging emerged and then podcasts. So when I launched my podcast in 2005, I'm like, the moment that I buy that microphone and the moment that I upload my first interview, which was with Greg Prince, by the way, after I did my own monologue. Oh my
God, he's such a great interview.
He was my first interviewee. And then the moment that I kind of pushed publish, in my mind is, Michael Quinn and Paul Toscano and, Maxine Hanks reverberating in my brain, will I be next? And so watching your interview where you talked to Margaret about her excommunication, you talked to D. Michael Quinn, and you talked to Don H. Oakes and Boyd K. Packer about dissent in the church and excommunication. That was a really powerful moment for me to hear them reflect. What are your reflections on that discussion about dissent, excommunication, and Boyd K. Packer, all that, Quinn, Toscano? Because that was a very powerful part for me, very meaningful to me. And it was foreshadowing of what would end up happening to me,
Excommunication, well.
And the church is still doing it.
It's one of the darker parts of this church, and it's so odd. It's, again, one of the contradictions of this church, which I gather we're not allowed to use the word Mormon, and whatever it is.
We'll talk about that Mormon at the end.
But this is a church founded in dissent and in radical socialist visions and thinking outside the box. I mean, this is an unusual church and a church that celebrates intellectual life. I mean, it's not an accident. And a Pew poll had this about 15 years ago. Unlike a lot of religions in which, as people gain academic degrees, they get more and more disaffected. There are tons of very educated people who become more serious about the church. I mean, this is a church that, at least as I experienced it, values a range of intellectual activities and ideas and celebrates the arts. But when it comes to church history, that's where the door seems to close, and I think it's a great mistake. And I've made that very clear. I made it clear to Dallin Oakes. I made it clear to Boyd Packer. I think it's a self-inflicted wound, and so painful to the people who are pushed out. I mean, it's just, if you are still a believer and you are excommunicated, I mean, it's not like other churches. I mean, you are tied into your theology and an idea of the afterlife and family and these rituals and the temple, that this is serious business. I mean, this really is, it cuts into every area of your life. And And there's so little pastoral counseling I found of so many people. And to Marlin Jensen's credit, he was stunned when I said that to him. I said, most of these people whom I've spoken to, and I spoke to so many people who'd been excommunicated, I said, never heard from the church again. He said, that can't be. And I think he was genuinely shocked. I said, well, I trust them. I really do believe that these are people whom I truly believe, and I'm an experienced enough interviewer over time to get a sense of when people are lying. And he was horrified by that. He did seem horrified. So excommunication is a powerful silencing tool when it's no longer a silencing tool, and it isn't anymore. It's a mistake. It is truly a mistake. I'm sorry to hear that it continues, and I didn't really know about your case. And I think Margaret Toscano gave such a beautiful interview.
She actually talks about the disciplinary council,
Yes.
and the stake presidency, and the men, and the table, and the long table.
The table.
She talks about just how they kill you with something about
Kill you
the
with
sinisterness.
kindness.
Yeah,
Kill you with
of us stabbing you in the back with a smile or something to that effect.
Yes, yeah. And she tried to counter their charges with facts. And I'm a bit away from the interview, but I do remember it had to do with women in the priesthood. And it's the early history of what did Joseph Smith say or not say, and what was the status of women around him. And she's very well versed in all of that. And anyway, I think that was at the core of what bothered them. And apparently, according to her, they cut her off midway through her defense when she was presenting facts based on texts about the status of women in the early church. They said, we just don't want to hear from you about that, and they really cut it off. And as you remembered better than I, she said they killed her with kindness and a smile, and at the end of it just came up and hugged her, and she thought, you've just marginalized me and cut me off from my family and a church I love and rights that are important to me. And why are you smiling when, in some respects, you just stabbed me? You know, It was a beautiful interview, and the most telling part I do remember now had just to do with her family sort of stepping away from her and the death of her sister, who died early of cancer. And she arrived with other members of the family to bathe her before she was buried. And her brothers wouldn't allow her to do that. I guess because an excommunicated person is outside. And when she told that story, it was powerful and affecting, and yeah.
Tough stuff.
Tough stuff.
You talked a lot about, women and blacks in the priesthood, right? That was an important thing. So you talked about a lot of the social issues.
I did.
I don't think LGBT issues came up.
Yes, they did.
Okay. So you talked about the three great
Trevor
threats to the church.
Trevor Salvi.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Trevor
Okay.
Salvi, and Marlin Jensen was eloquent about his pain, and he didn't offer up the youth standard. Well, it's all about it's the woman who's not married and can't and has no family and is cut off from that in the afterlife feels the same kind of pain as a gay person. He said, no, not at all. Oh my God, what we do, what the church says, and what the gay man or woman experiences is far more serious than that. That is a pain that is considerable and one we have to own. But and Marlin was filled with real feeling about that.
Yeah, at one point early in the church's history, in the 80s, I should say, Boyd K. Packer named gays, feminists, and intellectuals as the three great enemies to the church. And it sounds like you covered them all.
Yeah.
Did you interview Darius Gray? I'm trying to remember.
Yes.
Okay.
Darius. I assume he
Yeah.
was in the film. He's wonderful. I always bump into him at a lecture. Absolutely.
Okay.
Darius is wonderful.
Can you share your reflections of Boyd K. Packer? I mean, a couple things that were said in this movie that are kind of sound bites that continue to reverberate. It's Dallin H. Oaks saying it's wrong to criticize a church leader, even if the criticism is accurate. That came from the Mormons. And then there was this Boyd K. Packer talk about sentinels on the wall who are there to defend the sheep from the wolves, basically, or something to that effect.
Yeah.
What was it like to talk to two of those sort of self-appointed protectors of Mormonism, right?
Very different experience. I felt with Dallin, maybe because we went to the same university, University of Chicago, and because he responded so powerfully to the Mountain Meadows in a way that I think surprised everybody in that room.
It was human, right? It was a human response.
Human response, and an acknowledgement. He went further than anybody else had done. And in my conversations with him off camera, and in the lunch I had with him, I saw him then, and that was a while ago. It was good, almost 15 years ago, as subtle and smart, well aware of the liberal criticism of everything, well aware, anticipated all my critiques. And I push back always, whether it's him or any authoritarian figure, whether it's Christian, Judaic, saying, I know what's best for you. I'll be the guardian, and I will ultimately get to the place you want me to get, but it will be when I think you're ready. And of course, as a feminist, that's our past history. You'll be allowed to vote when we feel you're mature enough. So I have an inborn, it's nothing to do with religion, inborn pushback against authoritarianism and I think those answers I pushed back on. I said, well, I don't agree with you. I understand what you're saying. I think it's futile what you're doing because the internet is upon us, so you won't have that control. And control is what you want, and it's self-defeating because you have a chance now to control the narrative with young people, and you won't if you do this and delay. So those were, but he knew what I was talking about. We were on we had a long lunch and with his daughter, and I, of course I don't, considered him more liberal in all my views. Boyd Packer, first of all, I was touched that he agreed to do it. He had to know. He probably asked Michael Brodie to send over a few of my films. He knew that I'm from New York, and while respectful of religion, I'm a liberal, and he knew what he would call all my biases. So that, I'm touched that he agreed to come. I was surprised. I think Michael Brodie was surprised too. But it wasn't a great interview. I wanted to draw him out. I wasn't looking for sound bites. I wanted to know, I remember I learned a lot about his life, and I can't remember I wanted to humanize him because I knew that he is seen in caricature, most likely, because no one is that caricatured. No one, but he is sort of the Darth Vader caricature, and I wanted to get at that human dimension in him, and because I know it's there, but I didn't. And I was chilled by the interview, more by the feeling of it and his unwillingness to provide the nuance that he had to know was going to make his pronouncements easier to listen to. And you're right, the watchman at the tower was this kind of scary image. I'll be up there policing the information. And I didn't like having to use just a soundbite from him. That just goes against who I am as a filmmaker. And I just didn't have enough otherwise, so I did use it. I don't consider it a successful interview, and I was chilled by it.
So I'm going to give a bit of a lengthy setup to a big question. Those who know about the history of Dallin H. Oaks know that in the 1960s, there was this journal, academic journal called Dialogue, that he was one of the founding members of, right? And for many, many years, some people thought, well, you know, when Boyd K. Packer dies, Dallin H. Oaks will be more progressive-minded, and, you know, he's more deep, and the sort of things that you say you encountered when you met with him. So when Boyd K. Packer died, we were all just like, oh my gosh, it's going to be an incredibly new, it's going to be a renaissance for Mormonism. And we all love Marlin Jensen. We all have fallen in love with him as much as you did, and we'll talk about him in a second. However, there's something about the mantle of leadership. When I've interviewed someone named Hans Mattsson, who was a general authority from Sweden, who ended up leaving the church, he tells a story of Marlin Jensen coming to Sweden to try and help the Swedish saints not leave the church because they discover all this historical information from the internet that you foresaw. Marlin sets up the entire meeting by saying, let me just be really clear, we're going to have a discussion about church truth claims, but at the end of the day, you're going to have to choose. And you can either choose the church and God or Satan and Lucifer.
That's what Marlin said?
Yes, and we've got it. You know, I just published it a few months ago in the Swedish Rescue, and it wasn't sinister. It was just this very sort of choose God or choose Satan. You know what I mean? And there's something that happens, and even Dallin H. Oaks now, you found him to be thoughtful and deep and human. Right now, he has become the new Boyd K. Packer. He is the most anti-LGBT. He kind of almost sneers and smirks when he talks about how there are illegitimate families and then legitimate families, and LGBT families are illegitimate families, and he's become the new Boyd. And in 2015, the church put out this exclusion policy that I don't know if you've heard of, basically saying not only is it immediate apostasy to get same-sex married as an LGBT person, but your children cannot even be baptized. So, like, what happens to these people when the mantle comes on them? Because we know they're human, and you were touched by Oaks, and yet now Oaks has become the new Packer, and some say it's a more barbaric church for LGBT people than it was back when Packer was ruling. Do you have any insight? And we all love Marlin. So what is it? And you studied the Pope.
It doesn't have to go that way. I mean, look what happened to the Pope. The Pope, 3 months after he becomes Pope, he starts doing the most revolutionary things.
Which Pope?
John Paul II.
Okay.
I mean, so it doesn't, the mantle of leadership can give you permission to be your better angel, to be your better self or not. I don't know what to say. I mean, Marlin Jensen to me is, and I've interviewed so many people in so many different films who are religious leaders or claim to be or lead religious lives. He has a quality that is so rare of humanity, a discernment, true empathy, not just, I feel your pain. He feels your pain. I mean, I remember the New York Times review of this film, and, you know, they arrive with all their skepticism and the stereotypes that most people have and continue to have about this church. But they made one, and they liked the film, they found it fascinating, and they made one comment about one interview, and it was Marlin Jensen. And they said, when one of the leaders, Marlin Jensen, was asked about the church's treatment of their gays, I'm trying to remember the quote exactly. I mean, it wasn't, he said, the critic said, when Marlin anguished in front of the camera, you believed him. This is a New York Times secular critic. I mean, that's the experience I have with him when we're reflecting on so many events outside of the church, the human condition writ large, whether friends we have in common, problems that people have, news events, presidential candidates, whatever, this sort of searching, soulful conversation I have with him, and the way he treats people. I mean, I've been with him in many social circumstances, and I watch how, as we all know at cocktail parties, how some people can always be looking over your shoulder to the more important person. Not Marlin. When he's there talking to you, there's no one else. There isn't a general authority coming in. It'd be better for him to not waste time with you. I mean, he's there. So I really can't, I didn't bring up with Dallin. I decided there were concrete areas each of these religious leaders, these general authorities, I was going to focus on. I was going to ask the full, and for Dallin, I was talking about excommunication, intellectual history, and Mountain Meadows Massacre. And we circled around those pretty painful topics. And I never went any other place because I saved that for other people who had commented. Now you're telling me that Dallin's made many, many comments subsequently, and I have no thoughts.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to hear it.
No, there's something weird that happens the closer they get to the ring. I think of Lord of the Rings, right? The closer they get to the ring of power, somehow so much of the progressiveness and the hope seems to wither as they take on that mantle of running the church, of truly running it. And it's just something that I lament, and I'm just wondering whether it's from your stuff with the Pope or,
No, I mean,
if
the
you have
Pope
insight.
he went in the other direction. I mean, yes, he made many mistakes as a Pope, and he did some things that he shouldn't have, but basically, he
flourished.
He flourished. That's a good word. I would be very surprised if you say to me 10 years from now that Jeffrey Holland will ever move in that direction. I found him juicy, warm, self-critical, funny, could laugh at himself, which is the rarest gift of us all, not just religious leaders. I mean, anybody could laugh at themselves and not take themselves seriously. And Jeffrey, oh my God, he made me laugh so hard in my first interview with him about his disastrous beginnings as a Mormon missionary, and his chutzpah, and his failures to convert anybody. And one story in particular, I thought, this is a man who can laugh at himself, and he's also extremely smart and funny, and educated at the University of Chicago as well.
Yale.
And yeah.
He was a PhD from Yale, Holland.
I thought he went to University of Chicago. He went to Yale?
Well, his PhD was Yale. I know that.
Okay, all right. And anyway.
You found him lovely.
I thought Holland was wonderful.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
And I've had those same reactions, and I don't expect you to have been tracking Mormonism since.
I haven't.
But I had 2 lunches with Elder Holland. I found him to be backslapping, gregarious, candid, entertaining, fun. I had all the same experiences. And then, like, the very next General Conference, he gives this talk about the Book of Mormon. And he basically tells the whole church that if you are going to lose your faith in Mormonism, you have to crawl under or around or over the Book of Mormon, throwing down the gauntlet as if the Book of Mormon's historicity and, authenticity was so unassailable that you have to almost, stoop to the acts of someone who commits genocide to deny the face valid sort of authenticity of the Book of Mormon. And I met with Marlin Jensen personally as well. Again, 2 of the most lovely humans I've ever spent time with. And I'm just saying there's something about the way this church is and the way it treats leaders that it has them be lovely humans, and they end up, I don't know if you know this, but youth suicides in Utah have doubled since 2008. We lead the nation in suicides of LGBT youth, right? And in spite of that, we double down and make their lives even harder and say that if you get same-sex married, your children can't even get baptized. That comes from the leadership, and it comes from these lovely humans that you were charmed by and that I've been charmed by. And I'm just trying to make sense. There's a good cop, bad cop element to it, and I'm not saying they're intentionally doing that.
Well, but I think to be surprised by them holding tight to the historicity of Mormon history and the Book of Mormon is to be misguided. I mean, they are one of the few modern religions that are not, and have made a point of it. Hinckley said it very clearly on 60 Minutes. We are not moving to metaphor. This religion lives or dies on the truth of Joseph Smith's revelations and the Book of Mormon. I mean, that's out there, and it really is. And I think the church is grappling with it and has made quite of an interesting decision, because most modern religions move towards metaphor. And many of those religions lose their power as a result. They begin to say, well, we should see the resurrection as a metaphor for the eternal return of nature. That's great, and that may be closer to the truth, but you're going to lose a lot of people as a result. And I think the Mormons are struggling with, what do we keep from that fiery mystical core of Joseph Smith, and how do we accommodate, because we want to be of the world, to the 21st century and not lose what is distinctive. And so far they've been very clear about that. The claims of historicity obviously entangle your greatest scholars, and there's that pain. The theology is, to me, this is, I don't know the Book of Mormon well enough. I've only read it once, but they are not alone about gays and women. All religions have treated women as second-class citizens, all major religions. And my God, I mean, I wouldn't want to be wandering around in India just in any way say anything wrong as a woman and be gang raped and murdered, and which is what the papers are filled with these days. I mean, I think it gets tricky with Mormons because of your theology of the family and of the afterlife and the literalness of it. And that's where that great contradiction comes forth, a religion that is so intent on family and family life, nonetheless can hurt families so powerfully. So, but it's a long way of saying I don't think you should be surprised by Jeffrey or Marlin hewing to the literalness of your faith. By all measures, they are not moving to metaphor. They are not. And
it really is the wise move, because you weaken.
You can weaken, and many have. I mean, yes, yeah, and that's clear. So it doesn't mean that Marlin and Jeffrey in their personal lives, and this is where I think religion is the most important, is showing up as a friend, visiting the sick, listening with acuity and discernment to the people in need. I mean, a lot of the greatest liberals and progressives who've got all the right talking points about these issues of historicity and, the theology of heaven that keeps gays out and divorced people. All that's true, but they can also be some of the least caring people on an everyday life. So I imagine Marlin and Jeffrey to hopefully are manifesting the best of this religion in their daily lives, and I suspect they are.
I'm sure they are. They Really quickly, Gordon B. Hinckley, any reflections on interviewing a Mormon prophet?
It wasn't a great interview. I used little bits of it. He was as friendly and as gregarious as possible. He made me feel at ease. And he's very polished. He knew exactly what he wanted to say. He was not going to go. He was not interested in nuance, or in personal stories. I really wanted to just make him real. That's what and I can't remember the section I used. It was very little, but he was delightful to meet. He is a sophisticated media expert. He knows exactly what he's going to say, and he's in control of the interview. But gracious, I had no chill the way I had with the Boyd Packer interview. I liked him. I liked him a lot, actually.
But not real, not vulnerable.
I didn't feel that. He was also not well. He was not far from, and I thought it was very generous to, as you say, it hadn't been done before and might not be done after. He showed up.
He gets credit for that.
He does get credit. He does get credit. He does. Yeah.
So really quickly, do you remember, Michael Coe is one of the top 3 interviews of all time. And I learned about Michael Coe from the Mormons because you interviewed him. Mm-hmm. I don't know that the Michael Coe footage actually made the 4 hours itself, but the transcript of your interview with Michael Quinn,
I'm glad,
was online somewhere.
Yeah.
And of course, he's the Yale Mesoamerican anthropologist.
Yes, and the book of, what's it called? It's not the Book of but there's another.
Book of Abraham. Yeah.
Yeah, the Book of Abraham.
And you covered Book of Abraham and Book of Mormon historicity.
With him, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I just didn't have the time. It was a terrific interview. And we interviewed his wife, who was riveting, and I didn't use it. She was riveting, and she left the faith, but she spoke so eloquently.
Michael Coe's wife?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. No, it's another person. It's another person, not Michael Coe. Who was the wife of someone who was the expert on Book of Abraham? Who was that?
John Gee, was it? I don't know who that would have been. I'm not sure we talked about.
Oh, okay.
I'll have to look that up.
Look that one up.
But it wasn't Terrell Givens.
Oh, no.
No, okay.
Terrell.
Well, let's talk about Terrell. So really quickly, I again learned about Terrell Givens from the Mormons, and he's been on Mormon Stories several times. Mm-hmm. When I first interviewed Terrell, he told me in confidence that Deseret Book, the church's bookstore, wouldn't even carry most of his books, that he had been on some bad list or whatever, and maybe 1 or 2 of the books was carried, but he was sort of felt on the outside. Mm-hmm. After I interviewed him, after sort of this Mormon renaissance starts happening with the internet. Since then, I don't know if you know this, but he's been fully embraced by the church. He, along with Richard Bushman and Fiona, have been flown all over the world to try and be the gurus or the saviors to Mormons in faith crisis. Terrell and Fiona got a 3-book deal with Deseret Book to do The Crucible of Doubt and The God Who Weeps and The Christ Who Heals, these 3 books, all trying to bring what I call neo-apologetic, but this more nuanced, sophisticated theology and doctrine to Mormonism. Mm-hmm. And that started with your documentary. Mm-hmm. And I just remember you loving Terrell.
I adored him. And
so say reflections on Terrell.
I needed someone who was a believer, but who was very smart, and who was a total believer, and could bring complexity and credibility to belief. And he did that. He was an essential voice in that film. And I can't tell you the number of interviews I had, not only in Mormonism, but in the Pope film, or even some of the monks I never used, who used that deadening language of piety and of belief. And it's just kills a film, kills thought. And there you have Terrell, who well understands that he's had to leap over some intellectual hurdles to get to the place that he did. And he is there. And he knows the questions, he knows the skepticism, but he knows why he's there. And he's able to talk about the importance of the literalness of this religion and its distinctiveness, and also why should we find it any harder to accept the golden plates or any number of other things than we accept in Christianity. And he's got a huge, broad understanding of world religions, and it was very important, that we have that context as well. And because, as you know, around cocktail parties and sort of secular circles, the golden plates, and having a vision of God, and that's stuff of jokes. And then but many of these people have little awareness of the foundational myths of their own religions. Jesus walking on the water, Lazarus rising from the dead. That's one thing that Joseph Smith never claimed, that he could raise the dead. I mean, so the foundational myths are extravagant in so many religions. And Terrell, without sort of, not a debunking zeal, but was able to say, you have to see this in context of human history and religious history. And he saw the importance, and continues to see the importance, that this be a religion not moving to metaphor, staying literal. He says, I believe that Christianity, and he's right in a sense, rises and falls on the reality of the resurrection. That's pretty extraordinary. Why is it any more extraordinary than some of the things that we are claiming? And it's as important to Christians, that belief, as our Christianity, the Mormon Christianity, that we believe in our golden plates, and that we can, all the beliefs that are distinctive to Mormonism. And he was really interesting also on that question about why the fear of Mormonism. What is it about the Mormons that provoked not just violence, but stereotypes that belong to no other religion? And, the Catholics were hated and feared as well in the 19th century, but the Mormons so much more. And just leaving aside, the historic circumstances of them, provoking violence as well as being the victims of it and being in these charged situations, or, sometimes displacing people when they move to new territories, all those historical reasons that you'd get people riled up and angry with you. He talked about the theology making people uncomfortable, and he's right. I mean, to say you're the one true version of Christianity, that we're actually the version, and you Christians are not Mormon enough. In a sense, the early Mormons were saying that. Well, that's infuriating. That got people riled up. And also he was quite eloquent about how the Mormons, what's distinctive about their theology, which is that they collapsed the distance between the sacred and the secular, the sacred reality and the secular realities, and that God is an exalted human being. The body God is embodied. I mean, these are startling ideas that repel people as well. So we were talking, and he was very insightful about what was it that got people uncomfortable, above and beyond the historical situation in which, Mormons played a role in that as well. And, of course, Greg Prince, if he was here, he'd say, secrecy and polygamy adds to this mysterious other layer of fear and hatred of the Mormons in the 19th century. The 20th, there are other stereotypes that Mormons are boring and all wealthy, and what are the other stereotypes?
Racist, sexist, homophobic.
Yeah, racist,
misogynistic.
Yeah, right. But no longer fearful, threatening, killers, heathens, polygamists, because you're not polygamous anymore. So Terrell was a gift to us. He vivified belief. He gave intellectual credence to it with his broad view of religion in general, and I needed him for the film, and he provided a very important voice. He really did.
So how was the film received? And what What are your thoughts reflecting back on its role in your life and in the role of Mormons and the role of,
I don't know. I mean, I think it made a difference to Mormons. And talking to you today, it amplified that feeling for me, that it really introduced them to parts of their history they were either ignorant of or willfully ignorant of. And I think it opened up the church in a way that you say they're closing down on, but there seemed to be a flowering afterwards, an openness to the whole question of gays and, excommunications and the woman's role. I mean, just opening in the sense it could be talked about. It provoked rich conversations. And I'd like to think that in the world I come from, the more secular world, even though I'm an oddball in that secular world because I'm a seeker, I think it dispelled a lot of stereotypes. I mean, God, I'd get such obvious things from people saying, "My God, I had no idea there were so many interesting, fascinating, smart, articulate, funny Mormons who seem actually very much like us." Very much like us. And so the peculiar people became less peculiar.
Familiar.
Became familiar. And I think that was important. And so that, I think there's a real legacy there on both sides. And of course, for a filmmaker, that's very rich.
Did you get good feedback? Was it well received?
There really weren't any bad reviews. I mean, on the internet, there were a number of sites, and both way far to the right, way far to the left. The left was actually more virulent. How, the anti-Mormons, how could you not spend the entire 4 hours on Meadows Massacre? Or how could you not just focus on excommunications? How could you not? How could you not? And I did. I mean, I got a few quite angry notes, and then I did get some questions from the very conservative. Well, it wasn't. Quibbling. Brigham Young only had ex-wives as opposed to whatever, and why was it necessary to bring it up, and, things like that. But the critical reception was respectful, interested, huge, huge ratings, and Mormon DVDs. I mean, I don't get any of this, which is fine, because the PBS, supported this film financially with a huge sale of DVDs. I mean, just huge. People really wanted to watch it over and over again, which is true for a lot of my films, and I like that because you don't get it the first time out. You really have to sit and think about it. So that was all good. That was all good. And of course, I made all these friends who are still with me. I mean, I really...
Peggy Fletcher Stack.
Yeah, Peggy Stack, Greg Prince, Michael Purdy. I don't see Terrell as much anymore, but I have such fondness for him. Ken Verdoya. He's not a Mormon, but he played a huge role in telling the story of Mormonism. And he's so sympathetic to Mormons. He's, likely Mormon. Oh, there's so many others. Oh, gosh. Marlin Jensen.
Yeah.
So, and there are many more, but Will Bagley and Pat Bagley, both of them I see, and he's a great historian of Mountain Meadows Massacre. So, that's a lot to take from a film.
Well, on behalf of the Mormons, who aren't supposed to call ourselves Mormons anymore, what do you think about that? What do you think about the fact that you named this 4-hour documentary, The Mormons, and the current prophet, Russell M. Nelson, has now said that Satan rejoices when Mormons when members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints now refer to themselves as Mormons, Lucifer rejoices. And that's how you named your film. What do you think about that?
I'm just not going to say anything. I'm just going to roll my eyes and move on.
Oh, well, on behalf of the people who you gave spotlight to, on behalf of the people who you educated and uplifted and inspired, on behalf of the people who you humanized, I just want to thank you for making an incredibly positive mark on our people. You did.
Thank you. That's
Thank
a
you.
lot. That's a lot.
Yeah, and it's still having its impact. So you did us a great honor and a great service.
Thank you. Great.